All right, so thank you again for having these conversations just in the last 5 minutes. Thank you for coming. Thank you to our speaker for both your energy this morning, your sort of commitment to learning, and I think actually also the real-time modeling of learning engineering, you know, in front of a room of people who consider themselves both teachers and learners at the same time. So thanks for that. My name is Chris Capozzola. I'm the Senior Associate Dean for Open Learning here at MIT. I also teach in history, and I'm teaching next week. So I'm here for, I'm here for practical advice and suggestions. My syllabus is not done yet. My Canvas site is not done yet. So all suggestions are super valid. What I'm going to do, was supposed to be a fireside chat. We don't have a fire, but we do have some balloons to make it festive. I'm going to just sort of do a little sort of one-on-one back and forth with some big themes that I pulled out of the talk, and also some of Bror Saxberg's earlier talks and writings that I've been looking at. And then, in about 30 minutes, we'll probably sort of open it up to all of you, and hopefully some of the things that you just talked about in the last few minutes will come from there. So I thought I would just start, actually, this is a group of people who, some of us are really focused on teaching in the residential environment here at MIT. They know our classrooms, they know our students extremely well. Some of us are teaching in online, right? Through digital education, whether synchronously or asynchronously to a dozen or 1,000 students. What's your sense from the learning sciences and from from learning engineering research? Do some of the findings you've found here, do they hold equally in residential and online venues?
So it's actually a really good question. And again, Richard Clark, who I mentioned a couple of times in this talk, back in, I think it was the late 80s, he wrote a very controversial paper at the time in which he said, the technology for learning does nothing for learning at all. And that was kind of controversial among the ed tech community at the time. It seemed like, wait a minute. His point was that the technology you use, whether it is classrooms and teachers or whether it is online or et cetera, that in fact, that technology can make any learning approach, whether good or bad, be more affordable, more reliable, more available, more data rich. But it will do the same thing for terrible learning experiences. So just for a second, close your eyes and remember your worst ever college instructor. We all have somebody in our mind who's like, oh my God, right? Now, it used to be that person would destroy the hopes and dreams of only a few thousand students per year, right? And so contain damage, right? Now, thanks to the glories of technology, that guy's available in Uzbekistan at midnight. He's a worldwide menace to learning and joy, right? That is not a victory for technology, right? So the critical piece is to kind of get the cart and the horse in the right order. And so what you want to do is think through, okay, I have a current learning environment, and then look at what is the mind's experience of that learning environment? Not what is the technology used, but what is the mind's experience? And then use some of these principles to say, what would be a better experience for a mind? Forget the technology or delivery, just what would be a better experience for a mind? And then ask, okay, the available technologies I've got, whether they are human beings or whether they are, technology, how could I deploy those to make that better learning be more affordable, more reliable, more available, and more data rich? Mm-hmm. And so that's how I would think about it, is that different affordances, different learning environments have things that are easy for them to do and things that are hard for them to do. But you got to start from how does learning actually work? Like a big lecture theater, lecture theater. Some people say, those are terrible, they're bad, we should ban all lecture theaters. It's like, well, wait a minute. What can you do in a big lecture theater that is more active, that requires more deliberate practice? And it was actually, I think, your suggestion to get the chatter going in between things here, So I didn't design an active learning environment. I much prefer droning on endlessly to people than trying to help people learn. I mean, this whole learning thing is such a crock, right? No. It's like, no, that's what you want to do, is design the group experience. So Eric Mazur at Harvard, many of you know his work in physics. He had giant 300-person lectures that were mostly empty because nobody got any joy from them, until he started to put problems up on the board, have people try to solve them, use little paddles to say what the solutions were, and if they weren't getting it right, he could look and he'd just see how it was going. He'd ask them to talk to a neighbor and then try again, and if it still wasn't going, he would then dig in. Let's take this apart, right? Big lecture theater, one guy at the front, but he was actually, he didn't think of it at the time that way, he was applying learning engineering principles to the technology he had accessible to him. So that's how I think about this. I don't think about there is a technology that is somehow supremely excellent. No, they all have things that work and things that don't work. The human approaches, one of their great advantages can be motivation. You can begin to dig into whether people see themselves in this material, see themselves in these roles, and have a human conversation about how that works. And that requires real creativity, communication skills. That's not a thing that a textbook does. That's not a thing that yet, we can talk about ChatGPT later, that yet is able to be encompassed by technology. So there's real important things to teaching assistants and faculty, potentially. But then other systems, like computer systems, can patiently and relentlessly give you more practice, right? And so that has its own advantage. So in my view, some hybrid thing is going to be where we're all going to end up in various ways. It was a long answer to a short question, but
no, I mean, I think it's really important, and I think it gets at the question of motivation, and I want to spend a little bit of time on that in a few different directions. So one is, sort of what is the role of peer-to-peer motivation versus motivation that may be coming from an instructor, from an external force like wanting a job or a credential, versus motivations that may be structural or automated, right, in sort of an online course.
Motivation and how to improve it, how to manage it, has lots of different dimensions to it. In any way you look at it, you can be helpful or you can be hurtful, right? So peer learning is not always good. I mean, it's not. I mean, actually, when you ask groups of students, often their most hated learning experiences were group projects. I mean, just hated it. Either because they felt like they were dragging the dead weight along behind them, or because nobody cared that I didn't understand anything, so I don't care what's going on, right? So I just bailed. And I was just like, not good, right? Peer experience, no. Well, because it wasn't structured well. It wasn't created to be the right kind of supportive learning environment. And so often when you're thinking about, I want peers to help each other, they need some coaching in how to do that. They don't automatically come pre-wired to do that. And especially when you have a diverse group of learners who have not been diverse in previous experiences. When they come together, you can create unanticipated problems just because of that lack of understanding of where are people coming from? What has their lived experience brought them to? It's incredibly valuable to work together, but again, there needs to be coaching. And ideally, this doesn't happen at university. Ideally, this is happening in grade school and high school, where you get used to listening to each other, hearing each other out, listening to different languages and experiences, and seeing how to weave those together into better solutions. But it requires that kind of work. I also think peer work online can be just as effective as peer work in person. It may be a little more challenging because of the lack of the social element, the chatter or the cup of coffee or whatever. So that's a little harder. But nonetheless, if they're structured well, leaving a little space for that social community building before or after the more targeted conversation stuff, that really does make a difference. People talk about that, and you can see that in some of the data about discourse analysis too, about dialogues, things like that.
I would think that the peer, that sort of explaining and structuring peer work is just as important the 100th time that you've done it as the first,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You know, so even if you did do it in elementary school, you have to kind of restate it in every single classroom.
And partly because what it is that you're trying to have happen is different in different classrooms. The skills are different. Maybe even, you know, the backgrounds of students and such are different. And so you do want to think quite actively ahead of time about what is this going to be like. There was some work by, what was his name? Johns Hopkins researcher. I don't have the name in my head. Maybe it'll appear. He did.
We're watching the working memory.
Actually, no. This is.
lack thereof.
I'm getting old enough that I've got a boundary between long-term memory and working memory, so it's a little slow. Molasses in between there, guacamole dip. But anyway, this researcher at Johns Hopkins did some work on looking at. He did a meta-analysis basically of group project structures. Mm-hmm. How do you structure learning for groups to see what works better than well-designed individual learning? And one of the few structures that worked better was when you structured tasks to have group accountability for individual growth. Those words are important, right? So the group accountability means team of 4, okay? You put them together, they have all kinds of different capacities, right? So some are weak and some are strong, right? So group. Accountability to whole group, but to individual growth. Which means, if you're thinking right about this, a weak performer is an asset. Because how good can a strong performer get? But a weak performer is gold. If we together can get that person up the learning curve, let's do it, right? And so that ended up being a more powerful way for everyone to learn and get better than individual learning for each of the team members, right? So, but this is not how people don't think terribly structurally carefully about these things. They just pitch people together into groups. You're all going to get the same grade. Here's the rubric. You know, come back in 2 weeks. I was like, oh God, here we go again. I guess I'm going to write it.
Or even worse, you know, here, do this group task in a small group, and then 5 minutes later, you're going to do the exact same task in a bigger group,
right?
Or you know, and then with no scaffolding or something like that.
So you really do need to structure it, think about it. It's not good enough to just push people together. You have to really think about it to make sure people will get the most out of it, and that the diversity, like I showed there, that notion of the diversity of starting points is vast. And you've got to be able to think, how is this going to work for those who come in with very limited exposure to the context or the background or even the academics piece, and then how does it work for those who are much better?
So I want to stay on motivation for a second and ask, what does motivation look like in 2023? And in particular, you know, you've probably heard about this. Many of us have thought about the so-called great disengagement, right? Ways in which, you know, a couple of years into a pandemic, all kinds of other issues, distraction, changing sort of environments of classrooms. There's something there.
Yeah.
Right? And so, you know, both for instructors who may be feeling like they don't have motivation to take on this task, and then for learners who might need more motivation to jump into it.
Well, I actually have found that framework that Richard Clark came up with is actually pretty valuable in all kinds of circumstances. I mean, you can use this at home. You can use it with your kids. I use it when I'm refusing to do my taxes. It's kind of like, okay, Bror, why aren't you doing your taxes? What's the problem? Is it because you don't value getting them done? No, I have to get them done. Is it because you think you can't do it? No, I've done it for 40 years. I can do my taxes. Is it because something's in your way? Yes, something's in my way. Come on, no, it isn't. You know, you can find the time. There's a place in your desk for these things. Oh, God, yeah, I guess I can, all right. Are you bummed out? Well, I'm a pretty optimistic guy, so usually I'm not bummed out, right? So, but really, that framework, when you're looking at either individual students, faculty too, you know, like I said, Bror is not just a disengaged lump. He's a type of disengaged lump, right? And so you can start to say, which flavor is Bror? and then begin to ask some questions, maybe try a few things to see if you can make a difference. And so great disengagement, I think, is too general. It's like, wait, now let's try to understand what's going on. I would argue, like I said, involved with the pandemic, that fourth category, negative emotional states, swept the world, and a huge increase in people grieving and scared and worried about each other and their families and all this. And so, man, a lot of other things just don't seem that important in that context. So that's one huge wave of disengagement, which then can't be addressed by the other things. You have to get at that kind of directly in various ways. But like I said, it depends on the circumstances and issues of, like with remote work versus in-office work, and now some offices are demanding the workers come back to work, even though they have no evidence that they lost any productivity by having people be at home. Well, if you're a worker in that circumstances, you are going to have a little trouble maybe getting motivated about this job now, because I don't see the point. I don't get why I'm going back. And as an office manager, you better start thinking about, exactly why do I need them to come back to work? Let's explain it if I can, right? Now, truth be told, you might not be able to, in which case, guess where the problem lies, right? But in fact, there may be some reasons that you can come up with, whether it's creativity, or this is where you come together for 2 days a week instead of 5 days a week, and you create then reasons why people say, yeah, that makes sense. I really should sit with my team, and we got to bandy things around 2 days a week. Yeah, I hate my commute, but 2 days a week, right? So you're actually getting at that motivation framework by walking through, what's going on. And the what's in the way thing, absolutely, commutes. That's totally in your way. I can't, I don't want to. Well, what else can be done about that? Can you create a remote office where subsets come together, but they don't have to commute for an hour and a half? They commute for 30 minutes. Oh, 30 minutes, okay, that's better, right? So again, you're addressing a motivation challenge. What's in their way in that case? If it's not just, I don't see the point of even bothering to get together. Does that help at all? I don't know.
I think we'll find out next week, right? Exactly. Yeah. I would say, I think on this sort of question of explaining why, right, is really important. And here at MIT, we did a sort of report last year on sort of leveraging best practices, from remote teaching and pandemic period teaching. And one of the things that came through very clearly was that many instructors especially in spring 2020 and fall 2020, just made time to talk right, about things, and also to talk about why we were doing what we were doing, right? And I think your work really sort of would put a big stamp of approval on that.
Yep.
So I'm going to push you so we have faculty members who say my discipline is so important. What I do is so important, I can't spare 1 minute of my lecture time. So I'm going to put you on the spot and give me a number, right? If you're just going to convince that faculty member, right? Talk about your process and about your learning for X number of minutes, and you'll get Y amount of results.
Well, the good thing is there's a standard result for all disciplines and all human beings. Okay. I mean, otherwise this would be a hard question to answer, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Based on no research and
right.
30 seconds of
so
reflection.
That was satire or something. Right? I'm just saying. Well, a couple of things. And again, this is a bit challenging, but if in fact you are spending if a learner is spending more than 20 or 30% of their time in listening mode, in reading mode, in information acquisition mode, Houston, you actually have a problem.
Wow. Not that low.
Yeah. You really need to have 60% plus of the learning time being production of some kind. Now, you can kind of sneak some extra reading and things in under the guise of production. But it really is, you really need to have students be producing, be creating, be engaging, and lecturing at them. And again, what's interesting is the diversity of learners. You look out on a sea of quiet faces, okay? Some faces are thinking about, did I leave the kettle on this morning, right? Some faces, same expression, are literally connecting what they're hearing to what they heard yesterday, what they read in the textbook, and they don't think they've done a lab on this, but they hope there's a lab that tries to tie this together. They look exactly the same from the outside. But those people are actually creating their own deliberate practice inside their head without moving a muscle, okay? Well, that works for that 5%, but if you want the 80 or 90%, then you actually have to structure this into the courses so they really are doing this. So that's one piece of it. And of course, that is maybe the hardest argument to say, wait, but I love my lectures. I've been using these acetates since the 1970s, right? I mean, everybody loves them, don't they? It's kind of like, dude, have you even thought of digitizing them? It's like, oh, I don't know how to do that, right? So, and it's like, that's its own problem. If you think about instructional design of units and modules around complicated learning outcomes, you do want to spend some time up front in the course overviewing the whole thing, connecting it to why it's important to a degree or a program or other issues that are of value in the world. And then each unit, you want to do the same thing. And I would argue that part of it is a 5 or 10% kind of thing. And again, that's an average. The parts that are really challenging, you may have to make a more convincing case about, yeah, this part is hard. This is difficult for everybody, but here's why it's so important. And so you may need to have a little bit more there. And other parts, it may be either obvious and or easy, in which case you may not need so much. You can just quickly point to, yeah, you need this in order to get to the next piece, or this is obviously a key part of this whole problem stuff, so that's why we got to spend some time on it. And I would argue, I don't think we spend enough time on explaining to students why the learning method is what it is. Why do I have to do it this way? Can't I just slump sideways and watch YouTube videos? I mean, isn't that a good learning environment? It's kind of like, no, you must produce. And yes, that's effortful compared to watching cartoons, but that is the only way you will remyelinate your neurons. You must run the neurons to get the neurotransmitters floating around to create the biological changes that are what long-term memory is about. The reason, in part, long-term memory is so fast is because you've altered the structure of those neurons involved. I mean, I hate to be so mechanistic about it. It's not a moral issue. It is a biological issue of how the machinery works. And wishing doesn't change that. Like I said, it's really inconvenient. John Sweller, who I mentioned, who's done a bunch of stuff on worked examples, he wrote a fabulous essay about why the heck would evolution allow learning to be so darn difficult? Wouldn't it be obvious that if you could learn quickly, you would have an advantage? And so he puzzled at this for a while, and what he came out to, sorry, this is a little off track, but I hope I can go ahead with this. Okay? What he came out with was just fascinating, again, just as an idea, as an insight, no evidence behind it. But he said, look, we've only really had speech for depending on which evolutionary neurobiologist you look at, 50,000, 250,000 years, something like that, which is small in evolutionary terms. So assume you have no language. Well, learning is slow, it's difficult. I mean, you don't actually want to make it very easy to change your behavior because you might pick up something that actually doesn't work because it worked one time. Actually, we all know people who do that, right? I can run the traffic lights. Look, I just did. Woo-hoo-hoo. Okay, that was in the 60s. I went, under the influence. I'm not saying I did that, but I'm just saying. Anyway, so, you do not want a system that does not have the chance to dialogue and learn from each other, but it's just me. You don't want that system necessarily to change what it's doing easily, but you do want it to change. And so that's, his argument is, that's why it requires so much deliberate practice and feedback to change what's in long-term memory, to change what you're doing. But the result is now, we've been talking for tens of thousands of years. It wouldn't be cool to flip the switch that says, now I'm in learning from others mode. I just download the tape and I'm good to go, right? It's like, it's not how it's set up. It doesn't work that way. So that means we have to figure out how to do these repeated cycles of deliberate practice to actually make things work. So it's just that's the nature of the beast.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think there are no shortcuts, right?
There are no shortcuts.
I want to switch gears because I think it's important to kind of spend some time on this topic, which is the ways in which learning engineering can address sort of different kinds of learners, right?
Yes.
And so I'm going to kind of give you it's sort of a three-parter, right? Around sort of the question of equity, on three different scales. First of all, sort of within the classroom itself, right? Different learning styles, sort of learning disabilities and challenges, as well as the hierarchy between professors and students, right? Or teachers and students, right? So that's one. Number two, right, is sort of equity within institutions, right? Different kinds of courses that are more important, different departments, all these sorts of things, right? How can these sort of address it? And then third, the differences between institutions, right? We're sitting at MIT. We have a lot of resources. We have small, teacher-student ratio. We have highly talented students, often extremely well prepared. Not every university has those resources. So, so equity on these three levels. How does learning engineering speak to those?
Yeah. So. Again, you kind of back up in my mind to some of these first principles around, well, what are the outcomes that you would like from the students you have? What do you want them to become able to decide and do? And there's no harm in thinking you want the same outcomes. In fact, that is the ideal of good education, is people come in with a wide array of backgrounds and pre-existing skills and challenges or whatever, and that you bring them to some kind of high performance at the end of their experience in your classes, in your institution, and then they enter the world different than they came in, and that they are able to get things done. And then you have to confront, if you're working at your best game, and remember this is engineering, right? So there's your best game, ideal, and then it's like, what can I do in the time and money I've got? And you have to compromise, right? That's engineering, right? But in your best game, you would then be trying to figure out, each student coming in, what do they have in long-term memory? What's already there? That's a mix of skills. What are they already good at? But it's also, what are they interested in? And what do they already know a lot about? So I made a joke to one of my colleagues at the Gates Foundation about how, imagine if you had databases of math problems tied into various regional sports. So there you are in Minnesota, the curling capital of America, and you have a ton of different math problems about curling. And he looked at me and he said, Bror, nobody in Minnesota cares about curling. Don't ever use that analogy again. Here I am at MIT. I'm using that analogy again. But the point is, what do you have in your head already? What do you love? What's easy to draw from long-term memory? And that would be the starting point for moving towards challenging new skills. It's not the ending point, because you want to use your new skills to then find out new things. But when you're trying to learn to write persuasively for the first time ever, that is hard. And if you give a task to all the students, for some students, they understand the importance of the task, they understand the terms of it, and then they're struggling with the writing part. Other students, they got 2 strikes against them. Writing is hard, and they don't understand the task, they don't understand the context. There was actually some famous research done years and years ago, in math, where they created a set of math problems that were, I think, simple algebra problems or maybe a higher level arithmetic problems, story problems. And they used exactly the same math and even the same numbers, I think, in some ways, but they set them in a baseball context and a cricket context. And then they had a group of English kids and a group of American kids, and they then randomized these out to all the kids. And when you looked at American kids doing cricket problems, they looked pretty bad. And when you looked at British kids doing baseball problems, they looked pretty bad. Funny, when you looked at American kids doing baseball problems and British kids doing cricket problems, they looked pretty good. And it's working memory, right? That was the problem. That even though you could argue if you were a computer, you would strip out the context and see it's the same math, we are not computers. So what the heck is a wicket? Who's going over what? What? what is this about? I don't even understand what this is. Distracting monologue in working memory about what is going on here. I guess this is the analogy of, batting ratios. Is that what this is? Whereas when you're working on your own thing, it's like, easy, I got that. And now the math is the piece that I can focus in on, right? So imagine if we were able to do that in a classroom setting, but even in a departmental setting of people coming through different programs and all this. And some of it also is the work I talked about in terms of that outcome stuff, which is, are we really sure we know what we need students to decide and do at the end of this? So again, apocryphal, but that favorite accounting professor who always starts his course with the history of accounting. And there's an Italian guy, double entry bookkeeping back in medieval times. I mean, it's really cool if you're an accounting history professor. However, if you're trying to learn accounting from a business perspective, historian to my left, if you're trying to learn accounting for business purposes, really? And so again, you don't want to dismiss the interesting accounting history, but if you could begin from really first accounting course for business people, business majors or others, what do we need them to decide and do at the end? Almost no accounting professor, no matter what their love of history is going to say, they need to know who began accounting in the Renaissance. That's interesting, but it's not going to be on the list, or it's not going to make the final list, because you can't do everything, so you got to pare it down. And then you kind of work backwards. And the idea is, with regret, you may have to leave that first beloved module on the history of accounting aside. And so that notion of then thinking through, what do we really need students to decide and do, then also helps you focus. So we did the classroom level. What was the second level? The third level was institution.
At the institution, and then sort of in the entire higher sector.
And, at the institution level, I think it's the same thing, which is, what is the diversity of different kinds of learners I have? And even, and this is a really interesting and hard problem, what is the diversity of their goals? Where are they going to go? So Research University at MIT, researchers everywhere, they know how to train researchers. They know how to look for their beloved next graduate students, right? They can see that in the undergraduate course, right? So, I'm not so worried about them. I mean, there's still a bunch of things that they do as top flight researchers that they're not articulating, and that graduate students and postgrads, pick up in the street, basically. So they could be improved. But really, they're kind of in the mix, right? But if you're, teaching mathematics to a lot of people who are going to go on to become business majors or even engineers or other things, your love of theoretical mathematics and the nature of mathematical research may blind you a little bit to what that subgroup of students actually needs to become able to decide and do for their next step and their next step and their next step. And so, more clarity, more work on that, I think can then help decide, how do we do this well for all, and what parts do we need to peel off for different subgroups? Where do we have to stop saying everyone's going to have the same, and rather try to get some either subgroups within the course or even different courses based on what is their long-term need for what they're going to end up deciding and doing. And then similarly, the intake, what do people bring in? I really like the idea that some universities now are doing, even I think Harvard Medical School does this, in fact, where you may have on-ramps for students. So in the summer before they come, you actually work out, well, what are you really interested in, as well as what you got, and you may want to give them on-ramps so that they get closer to what most people are having when they get started. Mm-hmm. And it's not at all a bad thing. It's a good thing. It's your learning path, and everyone could have an on-ramp. That's fine. But for a lot of students, that could really help them gain the confidence and the experience of what it's like to be in the university. I remember...
It can put them, thinking about those sort of lines in your last slide, right? It gives
You're getting them up. You're getting them up that hill a little further.
Better place to start.
I remember, years ago, working with some high schools that were really effective with marginalized communities at getting them high scores, getting them into colleges. This is cool stuff, right? And terrific. However, they were disconcerted to discover the students would be leaving at pretty high rates, that they got to university and just weren't able to get through a year or two. They ended up coming home and saying, it's not for me. And so as they began interrogating and trying to figure it out, and we were having this conversation, what ended up happening, and this is just, in a sense it's frustrating, but it's very realistic, very engineering oriented, is to say, yes, you created a beautiful, adaptive, warm bath in high school that brought everyone along, helped everyone see themselves for who they were, and got them to be successful by all the important measures, including admissions to college. Congratulations. However, you did not prepare them for the cold, lousy bath that is college, right? Terrible learning environments, faculty who do not care about you or the horse you rode in on, busy, overwhelmed TAs, disastrously designed learning environments, right? Well, you walk into that and you think it's your fault. I guess I'm not ready for college. And it's like, no. College is bad, right? What we needed to do was spend your last year of high school actually practicing how to become your own learning engineer in a terrible learning environment. It was funny, they never invited me back, but I offered to give the first really bad university lecture in the fall of their senior year, where I would do everything that I had learned that terrible faculty do. I would use wildly convoluted grammar structures, polysyllabic phrases that I never defined, incredibly densely packed slides that I whipped through, and then I would just march out. And there would be weeping and gnashing of teeth behind me. And then the teachers could say, yep, that's what's coming. Let's start spending the rest of this year on the skills you need to survive in this. Because everyone is in this environment that's like this. And a lot of people have tools and methods and family members and other things. We're going to get you those skills to be successful. I think they were terrified that I would do too good a job, so they never invited me back, but yeah.
Okay, so we're going to switch to Q&A in a minute, so start thinking about your questions. And hopefully we won't end with the cold, lousy bath along the way. But I want to just ask one question, a bit of a sort of a push that I'm sure you get from time to time, which is this. This all sounds great. This also sounds like a prescription for a whole lot more testing, and don't we test students too much already, right? And whether it's college students or K-12 or whatever.
So this is a great question, and it's why I almost never use the words testing or assessment. I use the words evidence gathering. Evidence gathering. And the reason is, again, think about really great, even though impossible learning environments like one-to-one tutoring, right? One-to-one tutoring. That really works well. Especially if you have a well-trained tutor, wow, big lift to students. You just can't afford to do it for everybody, but there you are. What is it those tutors are doing? They are not lecturing for 90 minutes to the students. They're quite quickly, one, they try to get to know what is the student interested in, right? And then two, they get the student working and they watch them work. And I don't have to see the student circle D, whether that's the right answer or not, to know kid's got this one, or God, this is a train wreck. Kid does not have this, right? So as a one-to-one tutor, I am in this enormous evidence gathering phase, and also motivation. Is the kid engaged? Is he working? Is he slumped over sideways, looking out the window? I am gathering evidence, multi-dimensional evidence, and then the job is, how do I turn that into an adaptation of the learning environment? Do I change the examples we're using to something that's even more familiar to the kid? Do I back up? Because I can see where he went wrong. It's like, oh, I think I know what that is. Let me go see if I can test that and check it. That's what we're going to work on now, right? So evidence gathering is the thing. And the reason I say that also is one of the incredible boons from the use of technology for learning is that for the technology-enhanced parts of learning, you can end up with really amazing data streams. click streams, evidence streams, timing, all kinds of things. That is really rich information that your learning developers can combine with the context of learning and the context of the learner to offer advice to the teacher and the student about what might come next. And a classroom of one, for example, is something that's been around. Wait, they changed their name. They're now New Classroom, I think. And every night, they process what happened during the day for each student in all the schools they serve. And by the next morning, they have a customized, I think it looks literally like a flight boards in an airport. So it's like, Bror, Saxberg, you will be working in a small group on this thing today. And, off you go. And it's literally customized based on the data, history, all kinds of things, every day for that kid. And so that rich data then allows you to begin to customize those streams together. And I think that's a critical part of how we can actually end up making progress and doing well by students.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I can keep going, but I don't want to. I want to make sure that we open this up. What we're going to do in the Q&A is, do please raise your hand. We have some microphones that are going around, and I'm going to ask you just a favor, which is to be patient until the microphone comes. Because as you know, we are recording this, and so we want to make sure that the question gets recorded. And just very briefly introduce yourself to our guest and go for it. So, first one's there.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Oh yeah.
Thank you. My name is Babi Mitra. I co-lead a program at MIT called NEAT, New Engineering Education Transformation. It's an exciting pilot, but enough said about that. So what I heard you say, this has been fascinating. It's one of the most fascinating lecture presentations I've been at, and I'm glad I'm here. So what I thought I heard you say, you're a PhD in chemical engineering.
No, electrical engiering.
Electrical engineering.
Double E.
What made you move into learning science, this whole, not a very traditional route?
Sure, it's a funny story. So when I was in college doing electrical engineering and math, I spent 2 summers at the Jet Propulsion Laboratories. So the first summer, I really was a rocket scientist. I did communications modeling of ionosphere errors in satellite communications. And the guy who ran the communications research section said, I want you to come back, but we're running out of money. Space programs are always running out of money. This was 1977 or something. And he said, think of a new problem that we can use our top flight communications research skills for. So I thought about it during my junior year. I called him back and I said, I think one of the most interesting and important unsolved communications coding tasks is how the brain stores and codes information. So why don't I come down this summer and see if I can solve that? And he said, yes, that is absolutely a project for a college kid, to come to JPL and solve how the brain stores and codes information. Bror, Saxberg, you come on down. Come on down. So I went down there and I found out it was complicated, very complicated. But this was early enough. There weren't many people doing this kind of work. And I did some work on the cerebellum and how it was like a parallel processing computer and so forth. But I just caught this bug around the intersection of information theory, neurobiology, computer science, brain function and all that. And so that I then led, actually, as I said, Eric Grimson was on my committee. Tommy Poggio, who was here earlier, I think he just left, he was my thesis supervisor. I just got really interested in how the brain works and focused in on the visual system for a while. And then I disappeared from my MD PhD work to McKinsey to learn how do you put together people and resources and ideas and make them go someplace. And at the end of my 5 years there, that was when the so-called CD-ROM revolution took off, which is, the little round discs. Some of you may remember those. Anyway, it's been a while. And so there was a ton of multimedia happening, and learning in homes using computers was happening. And I suddenly thought, this doesn't have to be a research enterprise anymore. This could actually be like real world stuff. And so it was in the mid-90s that I jumped into the middle of this whole overlap of cognitive science, outcomes, pedagogy, professional development, use of technology, learning analytics. And so I've been in these kinds of learning engineering assignments basically ever since the mid-1990s. So that's how it happened. It was, I think many people's careers have sort of odd, weird winding changes, but that's kind of how it happened. Go ahead.
Larry Susskind. I'm on the faculty in Urban Studies and Planning a long time. Thank you. It's a wonderful presentation, inspirational in a lot of ways. My department has decided we should try to help each faculty member get better at teaching. It's the first time I've heard that in the 52 years I've been teaching at MIT, but I'm glad it's happening. So my question to you is, what does learning engineering and learning science tell us about what kind of feedback from either faculty peers or from students or some other sort faculty should be getting on a regular basis to help improve their teaching, not because they're going to be evaluated for promotion, but because we owe it to students to keep getting better as teachers?
So this is actually a really excellent question, and I'm sorry I forgot to bring it up in my talk. I'm so glad you've asked this question, which is, you know, there's a lot of research that shows that faculty and teachers have brains. I have references if you need them, because I know sometimes that's at risk, right? But, well, and therefore, professional development actually needs the same kind of attention to cognitive design and motivation design that anything for our students needs to, right? And so part of this then is go back to some of these basics. What would you like, or what do you think, or what can you discover your top performing faculty on the teaching side, what do they decide and do? And or what are their ambitions for what they would decide and do with their students? And that includes which outcomes do they pursue, but also methods. Then there's a bunch of these research and guidelines and pieces you can bring into the design that faculty can begin to use. And again, this is engineering, right? So some of it is impractical and it's like, oh, well. Some of it is like, oh, well, that's just as easy as the other thing I did. It's just, so that's better for learning. I can actually do this. But we also cannot ignore the motivation challenges for faculty members, teachers, trainers, all that, right? And again, that 4-part framework applies. There are faculty who are thinking, I've been doing this for 40 years. I don't see any point in changing. I'm good. Well, you have to kind of address that, because they won't start, persist, put in mental effort, listen to feedback, try it again, if you don't get over that boundary. Another one, especially for use of technology, maybe less so now, but a few years ago, some faculty will be like, I can't do that. Now the pandemic helped because everybody got kicked off the cliff, right? So, but you know, some faculty may still say, I can't do that, whatever that is. Again, that is its own thing. It's not enough to just slap down a white paper that says this is good for your students and for you. You really have to address that to figure out what's the story here? Maybe connect them up with other peers like them who got over that. And the third one is all these things about what's in your way. And again, really classic for faculty is, I don't have time to learn how to do this new. I don't have time. Well, that's one the department has to struggle with, and you know, colleagues have to work with each other. How do we free up time as a whole, more time for some faculty, less time for others, whatever, so that we are spending time on this? That's a thing. That's a problem-solving thing. And the last one, again, maybe it's departmental, but I bet it's more individual, is negative emotional states. This has been a hard couple of years. And a lot of folks, it's not like it just goes away overnight. And so you want to be sensitive to where your peers are, your colleagues are, and think about that, you know, as well. So I think all of these together are helpful. The other piece of this I would say is, as a starting point, is begin to help all your faculty have a sense of a learning model. You know, I'm not saying what we did at Kaplan is the ideal thing. There are other ways to digest it. I bet some of the folks from edX and the postdocs who worked with a lot of faculty may have their own simplified frameworks for how to get started thinking about human learning. But you would like to start with some language and some frameworks that the whole department can share about how learning really works. And some of these things about working memory versus long-term memory are really quite new to a lot of faculty because they've never had any training on how human expertise actually works. And as we talked about, You can't design learning for an aspirational learning system. You have to design learning for the real human learning machinery, bad as it is, good as it is. And that means you have to have some pre-existing models and language, and then faculty can work together, comment on each other's work. Then again, there are examples from K-12. Japan has a whole history of lesson study where faculty will pick out like one hard lesson, teachers will pick out one hard lesson, one thing, and faculty in your school very likely could identify, oh yeah, this is where we have a lot of tears, this is the hard part, this one right here. Have everybody begin to collaborate on that and try in their own way, maybe with some help from some of the other people on campus, how can we apply learning engineering, not to everything, because that feels overwhelming, but to this one hard, difficult bit. And then let's have people watch each other do that. Let's huddle together and see how are the outcomes. How should we do that differently? What did it feel like to teach that way? What did you all think happened in the classroom when we did something totally new? Let's try it again, right? Picking out even just one of those things and then trying to apply these frameworks to it may be a way to ease into it rather than feeling obliged to throw everything up in the air and start over. Is that helpful? Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, I'm John Harold. I'm a Digital Learning Lab Fellow in the Department of Material Science and Engineering, as well as, been a teacher and a student for quite a lot of my life. I want to say, first off, thank you so much for incorporating the motivational issues as a core part of education, because I found, especially in the time I spent as a tutor, like this may have been a daily part of my job is getting that motivation. But the one thing that I would like to know is when we're building these educational opportunities or these practice opportunities, do you feel like there's a way to incorporate keeping the student motivation into those opportunities? Because it seems like a feedback that could either go positive or negative. Do you have any insight on that or anything to say on that?
This was, as I mentioned, this was something we tried to pilot in the Kaplan University dramatically modified courses that we did, which is we pulled some data from students' interactions with the systems and tried to digest it in a way that would suggest to faculty which students were beginning to fall off the pace, that they were beginning to spend less time on the learning systems, or they were beginning to be later and later in their submission of assignments. Now that's systems tying back to human beings. There is also, and this just requires, I think, experimentation. There are also things you can do with, potentially, with looking to see, does it seem like from the data that a student is beginning to flag, and then potentially beginning to ask some questions. Are you worried that this isn't valuable to you? The challenge is when you use a computer to do that, it can seem pretty artificial. It can feel, so it would require some real design work and engineering work to figure out what's a good way of doing that. But I wouldn't say it's impossible. And again, especially these days, as we're starting to have some online tools like ChatGPT and things that may be able to feel like they're engaging more, that there may be new ways to do it that feel less impersonal because the computer is doing it, but sort of can wind up having a student relax and actually say something about where they're at. I don't think it's worth giving up on. I think it's worth continuing, but I still also feel like this is an area where it's going to be tough to fully replace people. Especially when you have folks from diverse backgrounds and all kinds of things happen in people's lives. And, humans can kind of understand that, but not so easy to fully automate that is my bet. So, yes.
Krishna Rajagopal, professor of physics here at MIT. So first I'll echo Bobby and many others in saying this, thank you very much, this most interesting and thought-provoking hours in a long time. So I want to ask about CTA. And let me preface by saying I wasn't familiar with that as a three-letter acronym before today, but everything you said about it rang true to me. But the example you used with a paralegal training was an example where you were seeking to educate people to succeed in a specific career. And so you interviewed people with expertise who were experts in that career, and you did what you described. If I think about education at MIT, undergraduate education at MIT, less than half of the classes that our students take would fall into that rubric. More than half the classes our students take and we teach, whether it's me teaching a physics class or Chris teaching a history class, more than half the classes our students take, the goals are more like those of a liberal arts education. I won't speak for Chris, but I doubt he's thinking of teaching future historians when he teaches MIT undergraduates. I'm not thinking of teaching future physicists either. And so our goals are teaching critical thinking, teaching citizenship, teaching modes of thought, modes of analysis, modes of reasoning, the scientific method, and teaching our students. We want to have alumni who go off and over the course of their career do electrical engineering, neuroscience, management consulting, and learning engineering, if I got it right. And so we're...
Who are you talking about? Yeah. Who are you talking about?
And so I want to ask about doing CTA for a liberal arts education. So pretend you were talking to a liberal arts group of people at an institution teaching with a liberal arts mindset. And by the way, in liberal arts, I'm including the physical sciences, the life sciences, humanities, arts, social sciences, the liberal arts in the broad sense, where we're trying to teach students who go out and can do anything and who are good citizens. I won't further articulate our goals. How do you do CTA in that context?
So it's such a great question, and it is right to ask it. You know, one approach is to think about the unified field theory of cognitive task analysis, right? The world-encompassing cognitive task analysis, right? How would you do something like that? And I think one of the ways to think about it is, this was actually funny, the Obama administration once asked me, what would I do with $1 billion spent in education to do something new? And I said, I would take 1,000 jobs that seem the most important, and I would do a CTA on them, and then look at what I got, and start to use that to work backwards to figure out what needs to be the skills, capacities, mindsets that lead to success across all these different areas. And one of the things about CTA, which didn't come out in this, is you will often find that there are things that are not in any way academic that are part of what top performers are able to decide and do. So things like communication skills, things like the ability to prioritize their time and schedule, things like program management, project management kinds of things. These are not like literally in the paralegal course, but the top performers actually have that as part of their skill set. So as you analyze, if one had the chance to talk to more alumni and their employers about what matters, what's going on, what do they wish they had, you can start to create potentially catalogs of those kinds of skills that you could then make sure are getting across to students somewhere in their MIT program. But I think it's that whole question of what is the right general education for citizens. There was the prior head of the National Endowment for Humanities who had a nice phrase for this. He said, education, at least in the West, should be about building creative citizens for a free society. Productive citizens for a free society. And those two halves are actually really interesting. The productive citizens part leans into that CTA stuff, leans into being productive, highly productive, top performing, and so forth. So you'd like to know that, if you picked out from your physics courses, if you had a sense of, there are 5 major places that these people are going to go, and I want to make sure what I'm doing supports them, you might actually want your alumni department or even you guys yourselves to go chase them down and maybe not do a full CTA. But again, this is engineering, right? But maybe really try to figure out, what from my course helped you? Because I think this might have helped. Did it help? What do you wish you'd gotten from my course in the sciences or in physics? What do you wish you had? And then kind of, bring that back home. But that notion of kind of really thinking through that longer haul and what's needed for productive citizens, that's a good thing. What's much harder is citizens of a free society. Now we're going to start to get into fisticuffs. People, look at the politics today. Oh, God, it's a nightmare. I don't know that I have anything smart to say about that. But we know in a democracy, We really benefit from citizens having some rich background to be contributing to a free society. And you could argue we're looking not so great on that right now. But what should go in there specifically, that's tough. But again, you would do it in a similar way of not just standing away and saying they just should be good citizens. You would want to make hypotheses about what does that look like? What should they be able to decide and do? There's a group called High Resolves that actually has a bunch of outcomes around global citizenship that are actually pretty good. And they have a whole set of categories and subcategories. And they're very specific about what does it mean to be a good global citizen? What does it mean in terms of how you look at information, how you think about yourself, how you work with others, how you work in your community? I mean, that's pretty good stuff to get at. And that would be all part of being systematic about, okay, how do I make citizens for a free society? So I don't have a great answer for you. But somebody else?
Actually, I think you may recall from your time here something called MIT time. So when something says it ends at 12, we have to end just a little bit early.
Oh, okay.
But the festivities, right? Remember the balloons, right? This is a festival. The festivities are not over. So the formal sort of Q&A discussion part will sort of end here. We'll do a great big round of applause for